welcome to another edition of Racial Equality and Civil Unrest, brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. We've been having a number of conversations over the last few weeks focusing on this issue as it relates to the U.S. mainland and here in the Marianas, especially the discrimination against African Americans by individuals and institutions in the country. We've taken this from several different angles: general introduction, U.S. history, the role of media and social media, Mariana's perspective, and now we want to look today a little bit closer at U.S. laws and court cases related to this issue. And it's my pleasure to have as our guest today longtime Saipan resident and attorney, and I would say my friend, Joe Hill. Joe, welcome.
Thank you, Catherine. Glad to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for bringing some experience and knowledge to our conversation. And as you can see, Joe and I are wearing our masks today. He came in with his mask, and as a courtesy to him and consideration, I think we can still make our point while wearing our masks today.
I think so. I mean, we shouldn't. I'm not here to rob you today.
Well, definitely I'm going to be more ears than talking today anyway. So Joe has a number of experiences aside from his knowledge of the law and court cases that he's going to share with us today. But just to give a little bit of a background on the issue of race and racial equality in our country. The Constitution, as it was first written, actually did not explicitly recognize slavery, and it doesn't admit that slaves are property. It's kind of silent on that particular issue. Although the Constitution did say that others, which basically meant, as everybody understood at that time, to be slaves, would be counted as 3/5. I guess what I'm trying to say, Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, is that only 3/5 of the slaves in the South would be counted as part of the population for the purposes of determining representation in the House of Representatives. So that is the reference really that's kind of given in the Constitution. And it wasn't until after the Emancipation Proclamation by President Abraham Lincoln that, of course, he declared that all slaves would be free. This was during the third year of the Civil War in the 1800s. And then a few years after that, they finally passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery in the United States. So that's basically a brief synopsis of how our country was founded, what was said about racial equality at that time, what was said about slavery in the early years of our country. And it's important to know this because the foundation of the country is basically what has helped bring us or brought us to where we are today. And then, of course, a little while after that, there was the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. And that was in the 1900s. And that is the first time the Constitution actually, I believe, uses the word race. And so prior to that, the word race was not in any of the amendments or the Constitution itself. So those are some of the major laws, parts of the Constitution in the early part of the country, which brings us up to a Supreme Court case that had a part in your life, Joe, which was Brown versus the Board of Education. For those that aren't familiar with this, can you explain to us what this court case was about?
Yes, thank you very much for that. Brown versus Board of Education was a seminal case in that it provided that for ending of separation in the schools, public schools. And it was a very important case at the time, but what they found out very quickly after that was that simply passing a law or amending the Constitution to cover a particular activity didn't mean that it would be vitiated or go away. And what it ended up with was what you heard about in Little Rock, Arkansas, was an example where they several years later they had the Little Rock Nine, which was the reference to the 9 students, black students who came to the Central High School in Little Rock and asked to be admitted as students there. And they were accepted, and but not without a big fight and from locals there in Arkansas and people. And one thing I remember as a student at the time is how, even though if you look at your maps, you'll see a United States map, you'll see that Arkansas and Oklahoma are neighbors, located next to each other, neighboring states. And in Oklahoma, we hadn't had any school integration or efforts at that point, and so everyone was looking at Arkansas as the lead event at that time concerning integration of the school systems. And I recall that I come from a very poor family. We didn't have televisions, and I remember that I couldn't wait to get home from after school, because I'd get home and I would, at that time, your favorite TV show was like one program each day, and the news was the favorite one because that's what the old people always watched, was the news. So I'd get there and I'd look for the report, the news report about what was happening in the neighboring state of Arkansas, is where the kids were facing the National Guard there with bayonets fixed, and it was just a real trying time. And I recall that it's something that was just ironed into my memory, and that was how resistant the people were. What I realized was that the opposition was sincere about their belief that we as black people had no place being in a white school, that they really believed that. And I came to understand that, and I remember this little chant, and I think some of you may have heard it also over the years. It goes something like this, and maybe you can fill in the blank end of it. I'll go like this. It says 2, 4, 6, 8. We don't want to integrate. I'll never forget that. It was just on a newscast, and these little kids, little white kids, were out lined up with their parents, shouting at the black kids who were 9 who wanted to go to school there, and this was their summary of what they thought and what they believed. And over the years, I've become to realize that you can't just ignore that. These people had some really serious built-in prejudices that are not going to go. Systemic prejudice, segregation, and civil rights ideas about civil rights that is systemic and is not going to go away without a lot of education.
I mean, I've heard about the Arkansas 9 before, of course, in learning about the Brown versus Board of Education, but listening to you tell it and knowing that you lived through it, and imagining, for example, myself as a parent of one of those kids, one of those 9, who, knowing what was going to happen when they tried to integrate in that school, it just makes the story hit home.
Well, it was a national event because it's like I said, TV wasn't that widely known at that point, but it was growing and catching on. But that's what the news of the day was for as long as that situation went on in Arkansas there, and it ended well, and we moved on from that. But it makes you wonder now today, so how far are we away from what the situation are? There still people standing in front of Central High School in Little Rock willing to chant, who remember this chant? I think there are. There are lots of people. And because that's something that's kind of endemic in the minds and psyche of the people, and it takes a great deal of time and education to try and eradicate that.
Related to this also, you had shared with me that your mom grew up on a Indian reservation, Native American reservation in the States, and you also remember segregation of whites, blacks, Native Americans, and what was it you were saying about that?
Yes, Oklahoma is, was it Horace Greeley that said, "Go west, young man, go west"? And when they got Oklahoma was about as farther west at that time that you could imagine. It's way out there, and I lost my point there. I was going to say they wanted them to go. They wanted them to
integrate.
No
problem.
Okay. Okay. Oh, what I was going to say was that going west, Horace Greeley had said, urged Americans to go west, young man, go west and make your home and life out in the western part of the United States. But when it came to Oklahoma, this was about as far west as you could go, and then they had the Indian removal program, where they basically, the U.S. government basically adhered to a policy of removing the Indians from lands that they had already had treaties with them for on reservations, making them give up those lands and moving way out west from the East Coast to dry lands of Oklahoma, where at that time, pre-oil, they didn't know that they had oil. And now, through court case, it seems like the Indians may have, Native Americans may have the last laugh on some of this, but it looks like they're getting, by the Supreme Court decision recently, that they'll be able to reoccupy basically about half of the state of Oklahoma is still Indian territory, recognized now by the Supreme Court, which is a big win because the Native Americans have suffered a number of defeats in the courts over the years. On almost every major legal point has come up about land, they've come out on the short end of it, and now they have a win situation.
Yeah, so this court case, McGirt versus Oklahoma, was just decided in the last few weeks.
Yes,
correct?
Yes.
And as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, the perpetrator was convicted in court of a crime, and he challenged it, saying that the court did not have legal grounds to try him because it had occurred, or he was on Native American land, and he is a Native American, correct?
Yeah, he had a right to be tried by tribal people.
Based on a treaty that the U.S. government made way back when with the Creek Indian tribe, that this land, half of Oklahoma, would be their land, would remain their land, and that hasn't really been it hasn't been honored through after the treaty was signed, and this court case, this Supreme Court case, challenged that, saying no, this treaty is still valid, and the court issued their decision that yes, half of Oklahoma still falls under this treaty, making it Cree or Native American land. Correct?
Well, yes, basically, but more specifically, how it came about was that Congress basically failed to take the pen and paper and write that they were retracting or withdrawing, canceling the treaty. It never happened.
Oh.
So somebody somewhere in the back room or just didn't think about it or thought about it and decided not to do anything.
Wait, so I don't know how much you know about this, but just a thought then. So when the U.S. government would execute treaties with the Native Americans and give them, for example, lands, they could renege on that just by Congress saying.
Well, they thought so because there was some boilerplate language that they used, kind of came classic in the U.S. that the U.S. used in closing off the last line on the treaties. They said for making this wild promise that for as long as the grass is green and the sun rises and the creeks run, that this land shall be yours. And that's it. They didn't put any conditions in there on whereby the U.S. had any rights to then go back later and said, you know what, you're part of this tribe, which had happened. The Creek tribe, it was a big confederation of us, a large tribe. Some joined with the South in the Civil War on the wrong side, and others went with the U.S. on the other side. And but at the end of the war, a reckoning comes, right? And usually at the end of a war, the losing side loses.
Generally, that's
yeah. But they didn't do that here because they just kind of sit on it, just like they took the approach that this was a war between brothers, the blue and the gray. Notwithstanding, it was a war among white men. That's what they were really saying. And then they said, we still, as white men, we're still going to have to live together as brothers. So there was a lot of that going on behind the scene, too, at the end of the war, because people were trying to reconcile. They had families on both sides of the line, northern family, southern family. So they had a lot of that. But that was one of the results, was that that this Supreme Court here now just said, well, that's what you said. We're going to say that is whether or not that could have been a termination because you sided with the South or the North. You didn't leave any room in the treaty for that. He just said as long as the grass is still, I think it's still up there, the moon rises.
The grass is still growing. So it'll be very interesting to see how they unravel everything that's been done when the U.S. government was using this Native American land, like you mentioned, oil.
I can't imagine all of the stuff. Now what they call the oil now in Oklahoma is basically all the big boom oil that they used to drive along in the wagon and see oil coming up out of the ground. That's long since been gone. Fracking is the one that they have now. But that's basically what the Indians have left now is the fracking, whatever that's left, whatever that may be. But most places we're finding out that fracking is not feasible and they're trying to get rid of it because they realize they've already withdrew all of the oil reserves that are there, so there's not much left. But that's a big piece of land. And there's all kinds of things about who's the landlord, so you owe me back money from back when, and people who have leases that are illegal because, it's not according to tribal law, and things like that. So it's a lot to be resolved.
I guess it's a little bit of a glimmer of hope that things can be set right or more right at times, especially when it comes to issues like these. I want to talk a little bit, actually I want to talk a lot, as much as you would like to talk, about one of the most instrumental pieces of legislation in U.S. history to advance racial equality, although it is not perfect, and that's the Civil Rights Act. You actually were personally involved in the civil rights movement, and even before the civil rights movement, as it was called, you were a protester, demonstrator, advocate, radical. What was it?
Original sit-in campaigners. Sit-ins being a concept that was developed where groups, civil rights groups, would go in, and when they find segregation, or even on whether it was in public transportation, eating, restaurants, buses, trains, wherever, they approached this from the point of view of ending this by, confronting this by sitting in and demanding food. In other words, blocking. They just go in, we'd go in a restaurant, for example, and say McDonald's, well, they weren't around then, but go into a restaurant and have a seat and order. They'd come, and of course they would not serve you. And in our particular case, they called the police. But we were so early in this process. This is 1958. I'm sorry, 57 and 58. We were so early in the process where I think the police didn't know that they were supposed to automatically arrest us. So
what did they do?
They just kind of looked around and just stood out of the way. And that's one of the amazing things about the Oklahoma City boycott sit-in, was the lack of violence. And maybe that's what kept us from getting notoriety like other places that came along later, and they seemed to want to take the title for being the first sit-ins, but actually the first sit-in for lunch counters and restaurants were in Oklahoma City in 1957, 58.
If the police didn't arrest you, were you finally served at these restaurants, or did you?
It became, you're right, I'm sorry. Yeah, we were finally served, but
I gotta give you a high five for that. You hung in there.
Well, but it was years later.
Years later.
As a matter of fact, I had actually, myself, I graduated in 59. And the sit-in started in 57, and we were still been going on. So when I left in 59 to go west, a young man, go west, I went further west from Oklahoma to California to go to school. They had already, it took me that long to get served because I was already left. But the others got served as these stores would usually decide on an individual basis when and how they were going to end their segregation. And some did as we went along, some early, others later, others hang out till the end. They said, never over my dead body and this kind of thing. I'll never sit next to a nigger like this, and I'll never eat but next one. So we had all of that.
Can you give us a brief synopsis of the Civil Rights Act? And can you tell us how, obviously it did a lot of things to advance the cause. Could you also share maybe how you think it fell short, if it did at all? What is the Civil Rights Act?
Well, what's your impression of what's the Civil Rights Act?
Civil Rights Act basically did away with, or was intended to do away with, a lot of Jim Crow laws, which was the segregation of blacks and whites, or I guess in those days the signage was colored. So yeah, basically that was it. A lot of the discrepancies, in other words, it's kind of like Brown versus Board of Education, if I understand correctly. It was like a lot of things were separate, like John Davis was sharing. You could go to the movies, you just couldn't sit in the same place. You couldn't walk through the same door. So the Civil Rights Act, as I understand, kind of was a big movement to, or a big step towards doing away with that segregation.
Yes. The objective images of segregation was reflected in the early days by just these opaque things that your signage, no blacks allowed, no Indians, Mexicans, or blacks allowed, and some had no dogs, Indians, blacks allowed, just whatever they felt that they wanted to put on their properties and put up there. That became, in some little towns where there's one person that basically owns the town, and they could put up these signs, and of course nobody touched it because it's private property and it belongs to Mr. So-and-so. And so you had these little, what we call pockets of segregation, that you could go into one area, and the area, because it's controlled by certain political powers, and at that point they kind of run, it's a company town, or company areas where people, you were known by whether you were a Jackson or a Hill or what, and it means nothing to us, but except somebody that's the name you got, if you got that. Many of them didn't have names like that, and you come out of a situation where they had not only directed you by signage about where you could go and where you could sit, what restroom you could use, and but they control you by who you could watch things with, where you could go, who you could go with, be accompanied by. Okay, so we can go to the next question.
Okay. You were mentioning before we started the show today that there are a number of civil rights leaders who have recently, I believe, passed away. And I think maybe for the younger generation who haven't gone through a lot of the things that you are describing, and maybe they weren't raised around this very strong racism, they're kind of like, why do we need to discuss this? This is not as much of a problem today as it was then. And you were saying about how with the passing of these great civil rights leaders, it's important to remember.
Yes, it is, and it's especially, I think Dr. King personifies that in that he knew, and he always said, that we're in this together. It's not a one-man show. Dr. King didn't do it himself. He did it because he had lots of people who believed in him and supported his concepts, his ideas and ideals. And that's what he used that to, what we say, overcome. We shall overcome and become a shibboleth throughout the civil rights movement. It's where all of the civil rights activists at the time, whether they were freedom bus riders or trains or airlines or they were walking, whatever they were doing, trying to overcome segregation, they all used that we shall overcome became the battle cry, so to speak, for that. And we have to keep that positive attitude and idea as we move ahead. And the young people especially need to know that, because there are names there are so many thousands of people who disappeared during the civil rights struggle. people that the names never come up because they are nobody on the scope of things. And but we need to remember them, that those are the Emmett Tills, the one that they find in the rivers and they're floating here and there are just hundreds of others that they never found. We just disappeared. People just disappeared. That's where you end up now with my great state of Oklahoma. You've been hearing recently about Tulsa, Oklahoma. Probably prior to this recent event, you probably hadn't, don't recall when the last time you heard the word Tulsa. And, but Tulsa came to stand for, it was a carnage of killing of over 300 black people, a whole little section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the black section that had achieved and functioned as the Black Wall Street of America. And the people there were educated, they were lived middle-class lifestyles, they had automobiles, they lived just like their white brethren had lived, except people couldn't stand that. And they ended up attacking that part of the city and just killing this many people. So now you have them going out now. This is 1921, was it? Yeah, I believe it was 1921, they had the Tulsa riots. They're now looking for the bodies, not the bones. Like we were here in Saipan looking for World War II bones. They're looking for people that are missing since then. And some people they never saw again. They don't know what happened to them. But Tulsa, and that's one of the things I say this, is that I think if there's anything seminal that young people can take out of this, is that we have to remember, we can't forget, and we have to continue, like in Tulsa. If you don't make a noise about it, nobody else will. If you don't make a noise about it. And that's what happened in Tulsa. Nobody knew, actually, when it was over, and that's been 100 years almost now, when it's over, people will just forget about it. I went through school for how many years now in different universities. Of course, I was right down the road from Beth, and my folks talked about this because it was an event. I had one of my oldest sister was 2 years old at the time when it was happened. She was born in 1920. Sorry. So we were aware there. It was part of a local Oklahoma history there. That we didn't feel that people didn't want to talk about it after the fact because they was still threatened. You know, they still were threatened. You still had to keep in your place. You weren't free to jump up and go out and on a Sunday afternoon and start talking about what happened at the Black Wall Street massacre. You couldn't do that. So we have that.
Well, I would say for me, like having these conversations has been painful because it's just so wrong to think that we can treat each other as human beings the way that we do. And but at the same time, as you said, it's important, even though we've made advances, and we can see that in our conversation here, it's important to know that we still need to work on this. There are still wrongs being done, and it's important also to understand our history in order to not overlook the lessons that we learned from history, or that we may still need to learn from history. I really want to thank you for making time to share your thoughts today, your experience and your knowledge. And is there anything else you might like to add that maybe I didn't ask about? I know you were saying something earlier about, what was it, running to the firing line, actually?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things I wanted to touch upon that kind of stands out from my experience in Oklahoma, because it's still with us now. And we were talking about the importance of education as being what we really need for the cure for a lot of this racial discrimination situations. And education is. I wanted to point out that Oklahoma, unlike most other places, Oklahoma had three or four different school systems in the state, separate. And this was created by the fact that for example, the Creeks and the Creek Nation, they call it, 5 civilized tribes, they had, pursuant to their agreements and arrangement with the U.S. treaties, they had their own individual schools for example, for the people that were on the reservation. They had a school that were members of the tribe would go to, and then they had Oklahoma State School for whites, separate. Oklahoma School for blacks, separate. And he's supposed to try to make all of this run together. And then I asked myself again, I said, well, why is it that none of these schools that I just mentioned, they spent millions of dollars each year, but they never mentioned one word about Tulsa race riot? And I've lived for 70 years under that now. I brought up my kids and things. But we're unique by having been born and raised in a place near to Tulsa. We're not far, that's right down the road from there. But my folks, they had Indian friends and things that we kept very close with the news, what was going on at that time. But those are kind of things that we need to ask ourselves. We need to stay on top of the written word. What are they putting in our books and textbooks and for the young people to know about? If you don't put it in there, it won't be disseminated.
It's almost like it didn't happen, unfortunately, in a written culture.
Yeah.
And there was something else there was another point you wanted to make.
Well, this may not be the one, but this is one of my, this is kind of, we kind of running off track here. How well are you a sports, for those of us who are sports people, I like to bring this one up because it's one of these other points I like to make about what happens when you don't put it in a book.
Okay.
If you don't write it and it's forgotten. I never known, same thing, that there was a black hockey league.
Black hockey league.
Hockey league, not just a player.
Okay.
A league, a whole league. Oh yeah.
I didn't know that either.
Okay, well now you know it, and it's black.
Were they any good?
Well, I'll let you. There's a book written about it. I'm reading. I know about it. I'm embarrassed because I learned about it because the guy came out with a best-selling book on the black hockey league.
Are you actually a hockey fan?
No, I never.
And
I'm excited because I could have been a hockey fan. Maybe if they had told me this. That's what, black. No, it arose out of the Underground Railroad going from the south to Canada.
Okay.
Through New York, New Jersey.
Out of the Underground Railroad.
Yes.
Wow.
And so the destination of some of these slaves were they didn't want to stop anywhere in the United States.
Right.
They wanted to get out of there, so they went all the way to Canada.
Okay.
And they tried to start life up there over again in Canada, being away from the American government and protected by the French and this thing like this. But and the book is called Black Ice. Of course, Black Ice.
Uh-huh.
So if you Google up, you'll find out there's a book,
Ice.
Black Ice, and that's euphemism for, and the slap shot. I don't know if you know about how much you know about hockey. Slap shot is the slap where you really slam the ball down there.
Yeah.
That was invented by a black guy who was a part of the hockey league. But of course we didn't know that either, you see.
Yeah.
So if you take those two, Tulsa, the book that should have been written about Tulsa never was, and the book where this guy went and did this research and he came up with pictures of them out of old New York newspapers from someplace, and they got actually pictures of these guys. I just couldn't believe it, because I never spent my time talking about hockey, you know. So, but it's there, and that's a good example, I think. But it's a great read if you want to read it, and it's kind of a light read. I mean, you can get upset too reading it.
Okay, all you hockey fans. Well, I guess, as you said, that's just to underscore the point that there's a big part of our history that a lot of us don't know about because it wasn't or has not yet been written about. And it's important to look at that and make sure that we know our history, which is why a lot of these conversations are going back in history, because that's the foundation.
Or who's writing your history? That's very important.
Well, you know, the victor always wins the history.
Yeah, well, that's right too. That's right too.
Not anymore. Now everybody can write their
But sometimes you don't know whether it's better if they write about it or if they didn't write about it. So it could be those kind of issues out there too, you know. So.
Joe, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing today. I really appreciate it.
Well, Catherine, I want to thank you I really do from the bottom of my heart for inviting me up, and we can only hope as we go forward that maybe something that we've said here today someone will hear, or in the future it may be of value to them in making the right decision then.
Absolutely. We hope that our discussion today is helping feed a informed discussion and dialogue on these issues of racial equality and civil unrest. And we just would like to reiterate that Joe's and I's opinions are our opinions. They may not reflect those of the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, but we would love to hear your thoughts and to engage with you in this dialogue. Thank you so much, Joe.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.